James Webb detected the structure because it was older than the universe. Carbon dating of light reflections showed the structure's materials had been manufactured 17 billion years ago, 3 billion years before the Big Bang, meaning the structure existed before existence, had somehow survived the beginning of reality and was now orbiting Earth disguised as empty space. And the structure wasn't hiding accidentally. It had technology that made it invisible to conventional observation, only detectable by Webb's specific infrared wavelength configuration. And when astronomers analyzed why this particular telescope could see what others couldn't, they realized Webb had been designed to see it. Its mirror configuration and sensor array specifications subtly modified from the original plans, by engineering changes that no one could trace, as if something had infiltrated the telescope's development to ensure it would eventually reveal this ancient structure. But the structure wasn't dormant. Analysis of its position showed it had been slowly changing orbit since Webb's launch, moving closer to the ISS by millimeters per day, and according to trajectory calculations, it would make physical contact with the space station in exactly 97 days. And carved into the structure's surface in symbols that predated human writing, but that linguists could somehow intuitively understand were instructions. A manual explaining that the structure was a seed, planted before the universe began, designed to wait until intelligent life evolved and built space stations that could serve as germination triggers, and the ISS was about to activate it, about to provide the final component needed for something that had been waiting 17 billion years to grow. And according to the decoded instructions, the structure wasn't a threat to humanity. It was humanity's purpose, the reason life evolved on Earth, the reason we developed technology and built space stations, all of it predetermined by something that planted the seed before time began, ensuring that we would eventually create the exact conditions needed for it to sprout, and in 97 days, we would finally understand what we'd been grown to cultivate, what cosmic organism had been using Earth as soil and humanity as gardeners for a harvest that would transform our entire universe into something else. I read this briefing 63 days ago in a basement room at Goddard Space Flight Center, Greenbelt, Maryland. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Someone had left a sandwich on the table. These details stick because they were the last normal things I noticed before my life became something I struggled to name. My name is Theodore Ashworth. I'm 41, and until last month, I worked as an imaging analyst for NASA's Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. I had a townhouse in Fells Point, a boxing gym membership I rarely used, and a younger brother named Elliot who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, over something so petty I can't remember it. 34 days remain. I'm writing this because everyone who knows the truth is either dead, missing, or no longer who they once were. Someone still has to remember. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing calibration data in my office on the 3rd floor of the Mueller building. Outside my window, the Baltimore skyline sat grey and unremarkable under a February sky. I remember thinking about lunch, whether I'd walk to that Thai place on St. Paul Street or just grab something from the vending machine. Then my desk phone rang with an internal extension I didn't recognize. Theodore Ashworth? The voice belonged to a man who sounded like he'd been awake for several days. This is Bernard Holloway, Deputy Project Scientist for Webb Operations. I need you in conference room B7 at Goddard by 3 o'clock today. Don't discuss this call with anyone. I laughed, assuming it was some kind of interdepartmental prank. Sure, and what's this regarding? You processed the November imaging batch from Sector 7G, correct? The deep field captures near the Booter's Void? The laugh died in my throat. I had processed those images. They'd been unremarkable, or so I thought. Standard background radiation, a few distant galaxies, nothing that warranted a second look. I'd filed the report and moved on within a day. I did, I said carefully. Standard batch. Nothing flagged in my analysis. That's exactly why we need you. Holloway paused. Bring your laptop. Tell no one. If anyone asks, you're attending a budget meeting. The line went dead. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my computer screen where the calibration data waited patiently for my attention. My reflection stared back from the dark portion of the monitor. A tired man with too much grey at his temples, wondering if he'd finally stumbled into something interesting after 15 years of looking at pictures of empty space. The drive to Goddard took 40 minutes on a good day. That Tuesday, with traffic backing up on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, it took nearly 90. I spent most of it trying to remember anything unusual about those November images. The Boötes Void was one of the largest known empty regions in the observable universe, a cosmic desert spanning 330 million light-years where almost nothing existed. We'd pointed Webb at it precisely because there was nothing to see. A control batch, baseline readings. What could I have possibly missed? Conference room B7 turned out to be in a part of Goddard I'd never visited, accessible only through a security checkpoint that required a temporary badge and an escort. The hallway beyond was older than the rest of the facility, with that particular government building smell of recycled air and aging carpet. Bernard Holloway was waiting outside the door. He was shorter than I expected, maybe 5'6", with a neatly trimmed beard going white at the edges, and eyes that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who'd recently learned something they wished they hadn't. He shook my hand without smiling. "You're the last one," he said. "Everyone else is already inside." "Everyone else?" 6 others. Imaging specialists, astrophysicists, 1 linguist for some reason. He held the door open. "After you, Dr. Ashworth." "I'm not a doctor, just a..." After today, titles won't matter much. The conference room was smaller than I expected, dominated by an oval table around which sat 6 men in various states of visible stress. I recognized one of them immediately. Desmond Vance, a senior astrophysicist from Caltech whose papers I'd read in graduate school. He looked like he'd aged a decade since his last published photo. The others were strangers, younger men mostly, all clutching laptops or tablets, none of them meeting each other's eyes. I took the empty seat between Vance and a nervous-looking guy with red hair who kept clicking his pen in a rapid, arrhythmic pattern. "That's Franklin York," Holloway said, nodding toward the redhead as he moved to the front of the room. "Best pattern recognition specialist at JPL, and that's..." "We can do introductions later," Vance interrupted. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been talking for hours, or screaming. "Just show him. Show him what we found in his images." Holloway dimmed the lights. A projection screen descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whir that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. "Dr. Ashworth, Theodore, what I'm about to show you is classified at a level that doesn't officially exist. By being in this room, you've already signed documents you'll never see agreeing to penalties you don't want to imagine." He clicked a remote and the screen filled with a familiar star field. My star field. The November batch from the Boötes Void. "This is your original capture," Holloway continued. "Standard deep field imaging. Nothing remarkable, exactly as your report indicated." Another click. The image shifted slightly. Same stars, same empty blackness, but now with a faint overlay of infrared data I hadn't included in my original analysis. And this is what happens when we apply the full Webb infrared spectrum to your empty sector. In the center of the image, where there had been nothing, something appeared. Not a star, not a galaxy. Something geometric. Something with edges and angles that didn't belong to any natural formation I'd ever seen in 20 years of staring at the cosmos. Franklin York stopped clicking his pen. "That's impossible," I heard myself say. The words felt distant, like someone else was speaking them through my mouth. Desmond Vance made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so broken. "We've all said that, multiple times. It doesn't help." "It gets worse," Holloway replied and clicked again. The next image showed the object's position relative to Earth. It wasn't in the Boötes Void at all. The void had been a reflection, a trick of ancient light bouncing off something we'd never thought to look for. The actual object was much, much closer. It was in low orbit around our planet, sitting there in the blackness between us and the moon, massive and silent and impossible. And according to the timestamp, it had been there waiting for at least 11,000 years. The room stayed silent for what felt like minutes. I could hear Franklin York breathing beside me, shallow and quick, like a man trying not to hyperventilate. On the screen, the geometric shape hung against the black of space, its edges too clean, too deliberate to be anything natural. "How big is it?" I finally asked. Holloway clicked to another slide. A scale comparison appeared, the object next to the International Space Station, which looked like a toy beside it. Approximately 4.7 kilometers across at its widest point, roughly the size of downtown Manhattan if Manhattan was shaped like a dodecahedron with sections missing. And no one's ever seen this. In 11,000 years of human civilization, no one looked up and noticed a structure the size of a city floating above us. That's where it gets interesting. Holloway pulled up another image, this one showing the object across multiple wavelengths. In visible spectrum, there was nothing. In ultraviolet, nothing. X-ray, gamma, radio, all empty. Only in the specific infrared range that Webb used did the shape appear. It's not invisible, it's selectively visible. Something about its surface absorbs or redirects every form of electromagnetic radiation except this particular wavelength. We're talking about technology so advanced that calling it technology feels inadequate. Desmond Vance leaned forward. "Show him the carbon dating." Holloway hesitated. "Desmond, maybe we should..." "Show him. He needs to understand what we're dealing with." Another click. A chart appeared with numbers that made no sense. I stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing, and felt something in my brain refuse to accept the information. Light reflections off the structure's surface contain trace elements that we can analyze, Holloway explained. Carbon isotopes, primarily. Based on the decay rates, the materials that make up this object were manufactured approximately 17 billion years ago. "That's impossible," Franklin York said, speaking for the first time. His voice cracked on the second word. "The universe is only 13.8 billion years old. Nothing can be older than the universe. And yet..." Holloway spread his hands. "The readings are consistent. We've checked them 47 times with 3 different methodologies. Whatever this thing is, it predates the Big Bang by roughly 3 billion years. It existed before existence, before time, before space, before the laws of physics that govern everything we understand about reality." I thought about my brother Elliot for some reason. We'd fought about something stupid, a borrowed car, an unreturned phone call, the kind of petty grievance that families let fester into years of silence. I couldn't even remember who had stopped calling first, whose pride had calcified into something neither of us could break. How small that seemed now. How impossibly, tragically small everything seemed against something older than the stars. "There's more," Vance said. He stood up, moving to the screen with the stiff gait of a man whose body had forgotten sleep. The surface of the structure isn't smooth. There are markings, symbols. Carved into the dark surface of the impossible object were patterns, geometric shapes within shapes, lines that curved and intersected in ways that suggested meaning, intention, communication. They weren't random, they weren't decorative. They were a message. "We've had linguists, mathematicians, cryptographers working on these for the past 6 weeks, Holloway said. And here's the strangest part. They can read them, not translate them. There's no Rosetta Stone, no key. They just understand. Everyone who looks at these symbols long enough reports the same phenomenon. The meaning arrives in their mind without any conscious process of interpretation." "What do they say?" I asked. Vance turned to face me. In the dim light of the projector, his eyes looked hollow, like someone had scooped out whatever used to live behind them. "Instructions. They're instructions for what happens when intelligent life builds a space station in low Earth orbit." The words hung in the air. I tried to speak and found my mouth had gone dry. "The International Space Station," Holloway continued, "currently orbits at approximately 420 kilometers above Earth's surface. The structure, we've been calling it the seed, based on the translated symbols, has been slowly adjusting its position since Webb went operational, moving closer, millimeter by millimeter, day by day. According to our calculations, it will make physical contact with the ISS in 97 days from the date of discovery, which means," he checked his watch, 62 days from now. "Contact meaning what, exactly?" "That's what the instructions explain." Holloway pulled up the final image, a dense arrangement of symbols that somehow, despite their alien nature, conveyed a terrible clarity. The seed was planted before the universe began, designed to wait, to watch, to remain dormant until intelligent life evolved on a planet with the right conditions, developed technology, reached for the stars, and built a permanent habitat in space. The ISS is the trigger. When the seed touches it, something will germinate. Franklin York made a sound like a wounded animal. One of the other men at the table, I hadn't caught his name, stood abruptly and left the room. No one tried to stop him. I heard his footsteps recede down the hallway, then a door slammed somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed through the old government building like a gunshot. "Should someone go after him?" I asked. "He'll be back," Holloway said. "They always come back. Where else is there to go with this information? Who else would believe him?" "Germinate into what?" I pressed. "We don't know. The instructions become unclear after that point, almost as if they were written for a reader who wouldn't need the explanation. Like giving directions to someone who already knows the way. You only include the landmarks they might miss, not the obvious parts of the journey. But there are implications." Vance sat back down heavily. His chair creaked under his weight, and I noticed his hands were shaking. "The symbols suggest that life on Earth, all life, from the first bacteria to us sitting in this room, didn't evolve randomly. We were cultivated, grown, shaped across billions of years to eventually create the exact conditions the seed requires to activate. Every step of human technological development, from fire to the wheel to the space program, was predetermined. We built the ISS because something needed us to build the ISS. "We're gardeners," Holloway said quietly. "That's the word the linguists keep using. The symbols describe humanity as gardeners, tending a crop we didn't know we were growing, preparing a harvest we won't survive to see." I stood up. I needed to move, to do something physical, to remind my body that it still existed in a world that had just revealed itself to be fundamentally different than I'd believed. I walked to the window. There wasn't one, just a blank wall painted the same institutional beige as every government building I'd ever been in, and stood there anyway, staring at nothing. My reflection stared back from a glass-covered emergency exit diagram, distorted and strange. "Why us?" I asked without turning around. "Why are we in this room? What can 7 men with laptops do against something that's older than time?" "Because you found it," Holloway said. "Your imaging batch was the first to capture the seed clearly. And because you haven't been exposed to the symbols long enough to change." I turned around slowly. "Change?" Vance and Holloway exchanged a look. It was the look of men who had seen something they couldn't unsee, who carried knowledge that had fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their place in a universe that suddenly seemed far more crowded than before. "The people who've been studying the symbols," Holloway said slowly, choosing each word with care. "The linguists and cryptographers who've spent weeks staring at them, translating them, understanding them. They've started to have dreams. The same dream, every night, sometimes multiple times per night. They describe a garden, a vast garden, filled with planets instead of flowers, each one blooming with different forms of life. Billions of gardens tended by billions of gardeners, all preparing for the same harvest. And in the dream, they're not afraid. They're grateful, peaceful. They say they finally understand their purpose. And when they wake up, they don't want to stop it anymore. They want to help it happen. Whatever the seed is designed to grow, they want to be part of it. They speak about it with this calm certainty that's more unsettling than any fear could be." Holloway's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We've lost 11 people so far. Not dead, just converted. And we're running out of researchers we can trust to look at this thing objectively." 62 days. The number kept repeating in my head like a countdown I couldn't pause or ignore. 62 days until something that had been waiting since before time began finally got what it wanted. And humanity had spent its entire existence preparing the meal without ever knowing it was on the menu. They put us in a dormitory wing that had been hastily converted from storage space. 7 cots lined up against cinder block walls painted the color of old teeth. No windows. 1 bathroom shared between all of us. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, a frequency that burrowed into your skull and nested there. I couldn't sleep that first night. None of us could. I lay on my cot staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains, listening to Franklin York's pen clicking in the darkness. At some point around 3 a.m, Desmond Vance started talking. I had a son, he said to no one in particular. His voice drifted across the room like smoke. Would have been 26 this year, car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway when he was 19. I spent 7 years trying to understand why. What was the purpose of his life, his death, any of it? And now I know. No one responded. What was there to say? There was no purpose, Vance continued. He lived and died to advance a species toward building a space station. Every moment of his existence, every laugh, every tear, every dream he had about becoming an architect, all of it was just fertilizer. Nutrients for something that doesn't even know his name. That's not necessarily true, Franklin said weakly. We don't know what happens after the germination. Maybe there's something... Don't. Vance's voice hardened. Don't give me hope. Hope is what they want. Hope is how the symbols work. You start hoping that maybe there's meaning in this. Maybe the harvest is something beautiful. And that's when they've got you. That's when the dreams start. I thought about Elliot again. 3 years of silence because neither of us could swallow our pride long enough to pick up the phone. If humanity had been cultivated for billions of years just to build a cosmic trigger, then our petty argument was even more meaningless than I'd imagined. We were 2 cells in a body that didn't know it was a body, fighting over nothing while the organism we belonged to marched toward its predetermined purpose. The next morning, Holloway gathered us in a smaller conference room with better coffee and worse news. We've identified a potential vulnerability, he said, pulling up schematics on a wall-mounted screen. The seed's position is maintained by something our physicists are calling a gravitational anchor, a point of artificially stabilized space-time that keeps it locked in orbit relative to the ISS. If we can disrupt that anchor, the seed might drift away. Buy us time, at least. How do we disrupt it? Asked one of the men I hadn't spoken to yet. A quiet, broad-shouldered guy named Oscar Whitfield, who specialized in orbital mechanics. That's the problem. The anchor appears to be located inside the seed itself, which means someone would need to physically approach it. The room went cold. Franklin's pen stopped clicking. You want to send someone to that thing? I said. It wasn't a question. Not want, need. Holloway pulled up another image. The ISS, tiny and fragile against the infinite black. There are 6 people on that station right now. Commander Douglas Ainsley and his crew. They have no idea what's coming toward them. We can't tell them. Any electronic communication we've attempted has been intercepted, altered. The seed is listening to everything we broadcast, and it's been responding by adjusting its trajectory. The more we try to warn the ISS, the faster it moves. So we do nothing and 6 men die, Oscar said flatly. Or we do something and... what? Different men die? We do something and maybe nobody dies. There's a prototype vehicle at Johnson Space Center in Houston, emergency orbital insertion craft designed for rapid deployment. If we can get a small team to the seed before it reaches the ISS, there's a chance, a small one, that we can find the gravitational anchor and destroy it. Desmond Vance laughed. It was an ugly sound, hollow and sharp. You're talking about a suicide mission to an object that's older than the universe, built by something so far beyond our comprehension that it makes us look like bacteria. What exactly do you think a few humans with tools are going to accomplish? I don't know, Holloway admitted, but I know what happens if we do nothing, and I know I can't live with that. The argument went on for hours, voices raised, accusations thrown, fear and anger bleeding into each other until the room felt toxic. At some point, the man who'd walked out yesterday, his name was Wendell Crane, I learned, a cryptographer from the NSA, returned with red-rimmed eyes and a resignation that frightened me more than his absence had. I'll go, he said quietly, interrupting a shouting match between Vance and Oscar. To the seed. I'll go. Everyone stopped talking. Wendell was maybe 30, with sandy hair and the kind of unremarkable face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. But there was something in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before, a certainty. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because I saw them last night, the gardens, the planets blooming like flowers." His voice was calm, almost peaceful. "It's beautiful, Theodore. More beautiful than anything I could have imagined. And I don't want it to stop, but I understand now that I have a choice. That's what the symbols really say when you look deep enough. We've always had a choice." Wendell .. The seed doesn't force the harvest. It offers it. Everything we are, everything we've built. It's an invitation, not a command. And I'm choosing to decline. He smiled, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. Someone has to. They took him away that afternoon. I watched through a window as he boarded a military transport on the tarmac, surrounded by men in uniforms who didn't understand what they were guarding. He didn't look back. That night, I dreamed of my brother. We were kids again, maybe 8 and 12, playing in the backyard of our parents' house in Annapolis. The oak tree with the tire swing that Dad had hung the summer before he got sick. The smell of cut grass and charcoal from the neighbor's grill. The sound of cicadas droning in the humid Maryland air. Elliot was laughing at something I'd said, that high-pitched giggle he'd had before his voice changed, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I'd forgotten existed. A sense of belonging to something small and good and real. I wanted to stay there forever. I wanted to tell him that I was sorry for all the years we'd wasted, for the silence that had grown between us like a tumor. But the words wouldn't come. Then the sky opened up, and through the tear I saw the garden. Vance had been wrong. It wasn't planets that bloomed there. It was people. Billions of them, rooted in soil made of starlight, their faces turned toward a sun that had never been born. They were waiting. Patient. Hungry. Their mouths moved in unison, forming words in a language that predated sound, and somehow I understood them perfectly. "We are the crop. We have always been the crop." Elliot stopped laughing. He looked at me with eyes that weren't his anymore, eyes that held depths no human gaze should contain, and said, "We grew you for this, Teddy. All of you. Everything you've ever loved was just the taste of what's coming." I woke up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, my throat raw. Franklin was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the wall. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older, stranger, like a photograph of someone I used to know. He didn't react to my outburst, didn't even blink. His pen lay on the floor beside him, abandoned. "Franklin," I said, my voice hoarse. "I can see them now," he whispered. His tone was reverent, almost worshipful. "The instructions, they're everywhere. In the ceiling tiles, in the pattern of the water stains, in the rhythm of the lights. They've been there all along, written into everything, and we just couldn't see them until now." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were wet with tears that caught the light like tiny prisms. "It's so beautiful, Theodore. Why would anyone want to stop something so beautiful?" I got out of bed and back toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the door handle. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, like I was piloting a body that had forgotten how to move properly. "Franklin, listen to me. You need to look away. Whatever you're seeing, you need to stop looking at it. Close your eyes. Think about something else. Think about..." "There's no away." He stood up slowly, his movements too fluid, too graceful for the awkward man who'd been clicking his pen obsessively just hours before. The transformation was subtle but absolute, like watching someone put on a mask that fit better than their real face. "There's only deeper in, and deeper is where the answers are. Don't you want answers, Theodore? Don't you want to know why you were made? Why any of this exists?" I ran. Down the hallway, past the security checkpoint where the guard was slumped in his chair with his eyes open and his mouth moving silently, out into the cold February air of the parking lot. I stood there gasping, breath fogging in the darkness, looking up at a sky full of stars that suddenly felt less like distant suns and more like eyes. Watching, waiting. We lost Franklin York and 2 others that night. Holloway found them in the morning, sitting in a circle in the conference room, holding hands and humming a melody that none of them should have known. The tune was ancient and alien, full of intervals that human music had never discovered, yet achingly familiar. They were still alive, technically. Their hearts still beat. Their lungs drew breath. Their eyes tracked movement. But whatever made them human, whatever spark of individual consciousness had once lived behind those eyes, had been overwritten by something older, something patient, something that smiled with their mouths and promised that the garden was almost ready for harvest. They didn't resist when security led them away, they just kept humming. 58 days remained. And I was starting to understand that the symbols didn't just communicate, they converted. Every piece of information we gathered about the seed brought us closer to becoming part of it. Every question was an invitation for it to rewrite us. We weren't studying it, it was studying us. And it was winning. They flew us to Houston the next day. Johnson Space Center sprawled across 1,600 acres of flat Texas land, a monument to humanity's desperate need to reach beyond itself. I'd been there twice before for conferences, but this time the buildings looked different, smaller somehow, fragile, like a child's model waiting to be swept off the table by a careless hand. Holloway met us at the gate with dark circles under his eyes and news that made them worse. Wendell Crane's transport never reached its destination. Radar lost the aircraft somewhere over West Virginia. Search teams found wreckage in the Monongahela National Forest this morning, but no bodies, no survivors, just nothing. Oscar Whitfield, walking beside me, stopped dead. Nothing? What do you mean, nothing? I mean the seats were empty, the cockpit was empty. Every person on that plane simply wasn't there anymore. Holloway's voice was flat, exhausted. The fuel tanks were full. The engines showed no sign of failure. The plane just fell out of the sky like something had reached in and taken everyone inside. I thought about Wendell's sad smile as he'd boarded the transport, his calm acceptance, his certainty that he was making a choice. Maybe he had been, just not the choice he thought. The facility they took us to was underground, accessed through a service elevator hidden behind a maintenance shed that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The elevator descended for nearly 2 minutes before opening onto a corridor lit by emergency strips along the floor. "Welcome to Sub-Level 9, Holloway said without enthusiasm. "Officially, this doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's been operational since 1969, built during the Apollo program as a contingency facility in case we ever found something up there that we couldn't explain. 55 years of waiting for a reason to use it. Now we have one." The corridor opened into a control room filled with screens and equipment that looked decades more advanced than anything I'd seen at Goddard. Men in white coats moved between stations, their faces blank with focus or shock. It was hard to tell which. On the central display, a real-time feed showed the seed hanging in space, its geometric surfaces catching starlight at angles that shouldn't have been possible. "We've been monitoring its approach constantly," Holloway continued, "and we've discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew." He pulled up a new image, a close-up of the seed surface, magnified thousands of times. The symbols I'd heard about were visible now, carved into the dark material with precision that no human tool could match. But there was something else, something moving. "Those aren't carvings," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're growing." "Correct." Holloway zoomed in further. The symbols were alive, microscopic tendrils extending from each line, each curve, reaching outward like roots seeking soil. The seed isn't just waiting for contact with the ISS, it's already germinating. The process started the moment Webb detected it. Our observation triggered the growth phase. Oscar grabbed the edge of a console like he needed it to stay upright. "You're saying we woke it up by looking at it?" "Not just looking, understanding. Every time someone decodes a symbol, every time a human mind comprehends a piece of its message, the seed grows stronger. The converted researchers aren't just casualties, they're nutrients. Their consciousness is being absorbed, used to fuel the germination." The room seemed to contract around me. All those hours we'd spent analyzing the images, discussing the symbols, trying to understand what we were facing, we'd been feeding it. Every insight was a meal. Every revelation made it stronger. Then we stop studying it, I said. We burn every document, wipe every hard drive, forget everything we've learned. It's too late for that. Holloway pulled up another display, a world map dotted with red points. The information has spread. Fragments of the symbol translations have leaked through secure channels, academic networks, even social media. Every point on this map represents someone who's been exposed to the seed data. There are already over 3,000 confirmed cases of what we're calling Bloom syndrome. People who've seen the symbols online and started having the dreams. 3,000 and growing. The ISS contact isn't the trigger, Holloway said quietly. It's the harvest. The seed has been germinating through human consciousness for weeks now. When it finally touches the station, it won't be planting anything. It will be collecting what it's already grown. I felt the floor shift beneath me, though I knew it hadn't moved. Everything we'd assumed was wrong. We'd been treating the seed like a bomb waiting to go off, when really it was a net being slowly drawn closed. Every converted researcher, every person who'd glimpsed the symbols online and started dreaming of gardens, they weren't casualties. They were the crop, the harvest the symbols had promised. Desmond Vance had been silent since we'd arrived, standing in the corner with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the floor. His shoulders had the slumped posture of a man carrying weight he hadn't asked for. Now he looked up. The people who've been converted, the ones having the dreams, what happens to them when the harvest comes? Holloway didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. So what's the plan? Oscar demanded, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. We can't study it. We can't ignore it. We can't contain the spread. What the hell can we do? There's one option. Holloway walked to a side door and opened it, revealing a smaller room beyond. The air that drifted out was cold and sterile, carrying the faint chemical smell of medical equipment and something else underneath. Something organic and wrong. Inside, on a table surrounded by monitoring equipment and IV drips, lay a body. Male, middle-aged, wearing a hospital gown that had been white once but had yellowed with time. His chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity, but his eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his lips moved constantly in that same alien hum I'd heard from the converted. This is Gregory Ballard, 53 years old, former professor of linguistics at the University of Texas. He was one of the first experts we brought in to work on the symbols, converted within 72 hours of initial exposure. But 3 days ago, something changed. Holloway pressed a button on the monitoring station and the humming stopped. Gregory Ballard blinked. Once. Twice. His eyes focused with painful slowness, like a man surfacing from deep water, and when he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse but undeniably human. I can hear it, he said, the seed. It speaks to all of us now. Everyone it's touched. A constant signal, like a radio station that never goes off the air, growing louder as germination progresses. But I can also hear where it's coming from, the source, the anchor point that holds everything together. He turned his head to look directly at me. His eyes held a knowledge that no human should possess, the resigned understanding of someone who had seen behind the curtain and found only darkness there. It's not inside the seed, Gregory said. The gravitational anchor, the core of its consciousness, the thing that's been directing the harvest for 17 billion years. It's not in orbit. It's on Earth. It's been on Earth since before humans existed, since before the dinosaurs, since before life crawled out of the oceans. His cracked lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. It's in the Chihuahuan Desert, 40 miles northwest of a town called Marfa, Texas, and it's been waiting for someone to find it. Marfa, I knew the name. A small artist community in remote West Texas, famous for mysterious lights that appeared in the desert at night. Strange glowing orbs that hovered and danced mysteriously on the horizon, splitting apart or merging together, behaving in ways no natural phenomenon could explain. Lights that no one had ever explained despite decades of investigation. Lights that had been reported for over 100 years, drawing tourists and skeptics alike. The seed in orbit is just a beacon, Gregory continued, his voice gaining strength. A signal fire, a way to focus attention upward while the real work happens below. The real harvest happens on the ground, at the source. If you want to stop what's coming, that's where you need to go. Holloway shut off the speaker. Gregory Ballard's lips resumed their silent humming, his eyes drifting back to that empty stare. Whatever window of brief lucidity we'd witnessed slammed closed, and the man on the table became a vessel again, broadcasting signals to something we couldn't see. 54 days remained until the seed touched the ISS, but the clock that really mattered had been ticking since long before any of us were born, and somewhere in the vast Texas desert, something ancient was waiting for us to finally come home. We drove through the night, 3 vehicles cutting across the endless dark of West Texas. I rode in the lead SUV with Holloway and Oscar, watching the headlights carve tunnels through the blackness while the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that now felt less like cosmic beauty and more like surveillance. The road stretched before us, a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Desmond Vance was in the second vehicle with 2 security officers whose names I'd already forgotten. The third carried equipment, sensors, communication gear, and weapons that Holloway assured us wouldn't help but made everyone feel better anyway. A convoy of doomed men driving towards something none of us truly understood. "I grew up about 200 miles from here," Oscar said, breaking a silence that had lasted nearly an hour. His voice was soft in the darkness, almost confessional. "Midland, oil country. Spent my whole childhood dreaming about getting out, going somewhere that mattered. Ended up at MIT, then JPL, thought I'd escaped." He laughed softly, bitterly. "Now I'm back in the desert, looking for something that's been here longer than the oil, longer than the dinosaurs that made the oil. Hell of a homecoming." I watched his profile in the dashboard light. There was something raw in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't expected from the stoic orbital mechanics expert who'd barely spoken since Goddard. His jaw was strong, shadowed with stubble, and his hands gripped the armrest with white-knuckled tension. In another life, another circumstance, I might have reached over and put my hand on his, offered some comfort, but there was no comfort to give, not with what waited ahead. "You have family still here?" I asked. "Father. Haven't talked to him in years. Same old story. He wanted me to take over the business. I wanted to study stars. We said things we couldn't take back." Oscar turned to look at me, and in the dim light, his eyes held a pain I recognized intimately. "Funny how the universe works. Spend your whole life running from where you came from, and it turns out that's exactly where everything ends." I thought about Elliot again. How many of us were carrying the same wound? Relationships severed by pride, time lost to stubbornness, words left unsaid until it was too late to say them. And now, with whatever was waiting in the desert, how many of us would get the chance to make it right? The Marfa lights appeared around 3 in the morning. At first, I thought they were distant cars, headlights from some highway we couldn't see. But they moved wrong, drifting sideways, splitting apart, merging back together in ways that defied any mechanical explanation. They hovered on the horizon like will-o'-wisps, pale and cold and somehow aware. "There," Holloway said unnecessarily. We could all see them. According to Gregory Ballard's directions, the source was 40 miles northwest of town, in a stretch of desert that belonged to no one. We left the paved road and continued on dirt tracks that barely deserved the name, the vehicles bouncing over scrub and rock while the lights grew closer. And then, without warning, they went out. All of them. Every mysterious glow that had danced on the horizon for over a century simply vanished, leaving nothing but starlight and the sweep of our headlights across empty sand. "That's not good," Oscar muttered. The radio crackled, Vance's voice tight with something I couldn't identify. "Holloway, stop the vehicles. Now." Holloway hit the brakes. Dust billowed around us, caught in the headlights like brown fog. Through the swirling particles, I saw something that made my breath catch. The ground ahead wasn't ground anymore, it was glass, a vast circle of fused sand, perfectly smooth, reflecting the stars like a black mirror. And in the center of that mirror, rising from the desert floor like the spine of some buried leviathan, was a spire. It was maybe 30 feet tall, made of the same dark material as the seed in orbit, geometric, impossible, and covered in symbols that seemed to writhe at the edge of perception, never quite holding still long enough to focus on. Looking at it felt like staring into a wound in the fabric of reality itself, a place where the rules that governed everything else simply didn't apply. "That's it," Holloway breathed. "The anchor point. Son of a bitch. It's really here." We approached on foot, leaving the vehicles behind with their engines running. The glass was cold beneath my boots despite the desert air, and it made no sound when we walked. Our footsteps simply disappeared, swallowed by something that didn't want to be heard. Each step felt like a violation, like we were trespassing on ground that had been sacred since before the earth had cooled. Vance reached the spire first. He stood before it with his head tilted back, staring up at the symbols, and I saw his lips moving silently. His posture had changed somehow, become looser, more fluid, as if his body was remembering movements it had never learned. "Desmond," I called out, my voice sounding thin and small in the vast silence. "Don't look at them. Remember what happened to Franklin." He didn't respond. His hands rose slowly, reaching toward the dark surface like a man in a trance. The security officers flanked him, uncertain, looking to Holloway for guidance. "Desmond!" I grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. His eyes were wrong, not empty like the converted. Worse, they were full, overflowing with something that shouldn't fit inside a human skull. And when he spoke, his voice harmonized with itself, layers of sound that couldn't come from a single throat. "I've been listening since the plane, Theodore, since Wendell showed me what was waiting. Do you know how beautiful it is? The garden that's coming. Every consciousness that's ever existed, every thought, every dream, every moment of love or grief or joy, all of it preserved, cultivated, grown into something eternal." I stumbled backward. The security officers raised their weapons, but Vance moved faster than any human should, striking one across the jaw and sending him sprawling onto the glass. The other fired. The shot rang out across the empty desert, but Vance was already inside his guard, wrenching the rifle away with hands that moved like water. "The harvest isn't death," Vance continued, advancing toward me with that terrible calm. "It's transcendence. Everything we are becomes part of something larger, something that will outlast the stars themselves. Why would anyone fight against that?" "Because it's not a choice," I said, backing toward the spire. I could feel it behind me now, a pressure against my thoughts, a whisper promising peace. "It's consumption. It's being eaten by something that doesn't care what we want. Caring is a human limitation. The garden doesn't need to care, it only needs to grow." He lunged. I dodged sideways, my shoulder clipping the spire's surface, and the contact sent a jolt through my entire body. Images flooded my mind. The garden, yes, but also something behind it. Something that tended the garden, that had planted seeds across 1,000 universes, that harvested consciousness like a farmer harvesting wheat. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't benevolent. It simply was, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to anything as small as human will. I screamed. I think I screamed. The world went white and red and colors that had no names. And when I came back to myself, I was on my knees on the glass with blood running from my nose and Vance standing over me, his hand outstretched. "Join us, Theodore. Your brother is already waiting in the garden, Elliot. He started dreaming 3 weeks ago after the data leaked online. He's been calling for you. Elliot, my brother, the one I hadn't spoken to in 3 years." "You're lying." "The garden doesn't lie. It doesn't need to. Everything it promises is true." Vance smiled with a mouth that no longer looked quite human. "He forgives you, Theodore. For the car, for the silence, for all of it. He wants you to come home." A gunshot cracked through the night. Vance jerked, staggered, and I saw Oscar standing 20 feet away with a pistol raised, his face twisted with grief and rage. "Get away from him," Oscar said. Vance turned slowly, the wound in his shoulder already closing, the flesh knitting itself together with a wet sound. "Oscar, I wondered when you'd find your courage. Your father is in the garden too, did you know? All those years of anger, all that wasted time, it doesn't matter anymore. He understands now. He's proud of you." Oscar fired again and again. Each bullet struck home, each wound healed almost instantly, and Vance kept walking toward him with that serene, terrible smile. I ran. Not away from the spire, toward it. I didn't have a plan, didn't have a weapon, didn't have anything but the desperate certainty that if I didn't do something, we would all end up in that garden whether we wanted to or not. My hands found the surface of the spire. The symbols blazed to life at my touch, burning themselves into my vision, and I felt the whispers again. But this time, I pushed back. I thought of Elliot. Not the dream version promising forgiveness, but the real Elliot. The kid who'd laughed at my jokes. The teenager who'd borrowed my car without asking. The man who'd stood across from me at our mother's funeral and said things we both regretted. I thought about how much I wanted to tell him I was sorry. Not in some cosmic garden, not as part of some harvested consciousness, but here, now, in person, as myself. The spire cracked. A fissure ran up its surface, splitting the symbols, interrupting whatever circuit they formed. The whispers turned to screams, not human screams, something older and larger and infinitely more terrible. The glass beneath our feet began to fracture, spreading outward in a web of breaks that caught the starlight like frozen lightning. Vance collapsed, the alien grace draining from his movements, leaving behind a man who suddenly looked every one of his 60 years. Oscar caught him before he hit the ground, cradling him like a child. "What did you do?" Holloway shouted, running toward me as the spire continued to fracture. "What the hell did you do?" "I don't know," I said honestly. The world was spinning. My nose was still bleeding, and my thoughts felt like they'd been scrambled and only partially reassembled. I just wanted it to stop. The spire shattered, not into pieces, into light. A column of brilliance erupted from the desert floor, shooting upward into the night sky like a signal flare for something beyond the stars, and somewhere far above us, I imagined the seed feeling its anchor point destroyed, beginning to drift away from the ISS, away from the Earth, away from the harvest it had waited 17 billion years to collect. But as the light faded and silence reclaimed the desert, Gregory Ballard's words echoed in my memory with new and terrible clarity. The source, the anchor point. If you want to stop what's coming, that's where you need to go. He'd told us to find it. He'd told us to go there. And we'd done exactly what he said, exactly what something wanted us to do. The spire was destroyed. The Marfa lights had gone dark forever. But as I looked down at Vance's unconscious form, at Oscar's tear-streaked face, at the cracks spreading across the glass like a disease, I realized we hadn't stopped anything. We'd just moved to the next phase of the plan, a plan that had been written 17 billion years ago by something that had never once been surprised by anything we'd done. And we had walked right into it, eyes wide open, foolishly believing ourselves heroes when we were only pawns. Dawn broke over the desert in shades of rust and gold, painting the cracked glass plain like a wound in the earth. We sat among the fragments of the shattered spire, 3 survivors of a battle we hadn't understood, waiting for someone to tell us what came next. Vance was unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Whatever had possessed him had retreated when the spire fell, leaving behind a man who looked hollowed out, emptied of something essential. Oscar sat beside him, checking his pulse every few minutes with fingers that trembled slightly each time. Holloway was on the satellite phone with Houston, his voice a low murmur I couldn't quite make out. From his expression, the way his jaw kept tightening, the way he rubbed his temple like he was trying to push away a headache that wouldn't quit, the news wasn't good. I walked to the edge of the glass circle and stared out at the desert. The sun was warm on my face, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. Normal sounds, normal sensations. They felt like lies now, like a thin skin stretched over something rotten. "Theodore." I turned. Oscar had left Vance's side and walked over to stand beside me. In the morning light, I could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the dark circles under his eyes, the lines around his mouth that seemed deeper than they'd been yesterday. He looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a single night. "How's Desmond?" I asked. "Alive. Whether that's a good thing or not, I honestly don't know anymore." Oscar was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "What you did back there with the spire, how did you know that would work?" "I didn't. I searched for words that could explain something I barely understood myself. I thought about my brother, about all the things I never said to him, all the time I wasted being angry over nothing. And I realized I didn't want to become part of some cosmic garden without ever telling him I was sorry. I wanted to be me when I said it, not some absorbed consciousness in an eternal harvest. Just me. Oscar nodded slowly. Human stubbornness. Maybe that's the one thing they didn't account for in their 17-billion-year plan. Or maybe it's exactly what they counted on. Holloway approached, the satellite phone hanging limp at his side. His face told the story before his words did. The spire wasn't an anchor, he said flatly. It was a lock, something that was keeping the seed dormant, preventing full activation. When we destroyed it, we didn't stop the germination. We completed it. The bird stopped singing, or maybe I just stopped hearing it. The seed is moving now, Holloway continued. Not drifting, moving, accelerating toward the ISS at a rate that shouldn't be physically possible. Contact has been revised from 54 days to... He checked his phone again, as if hoping the numbers had changed. 18 hours. 18 hours. Less than a day until something that had been waiting since before the universe began finally claimed its harvest, and we had given it the key. There has to be something we can do, Oscar said. The ISS. Can we evacuate the crew? Even if we could reach them in time, it wouldn't matter. The harvest isn't about the station. It's about the people who've been converted, the 3,000 with Bloom syndrome, everyone who's dreamed of the garden. When the seed touches the ISS, it becomes fully active, and then it collects. Every consciousness it's touched, no matter where they are on Earth, gets pulled in. I thought of Elliot. 3 weeks of dreaming, Vance had said. 3 weeks of being slowly prepared for a harvest he didn't know was coming. Then we go to the seed, I heard myself say, physically. We take one of those emergency orbital insertion craft you mentioned, and we go up there and we find a way to stop it before it reaches the station. Holloway stared at me like I'd suggested we sprout wings and fly. That's suicide. The craft exists, yes, but it's designed for emergency retrieval, not combat. You'd have no weapons, no plan, no way to actually affect a structure that survived the birth of the universe. We affected the spire. The spire was a component, a piece of a larger system. The seed itself is. He trailed off, shaking his head. You'd be throwing your life away for nothing. Maybe. I looked at Oscar, then back at Holloway. But my brother is going to be harvested in 18 hours unless someone does something. And I've spent 3 years not doing something about the things that matter. I'm done with that. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of impossible choices. Then Oscar stepped forward. I'm going with you. Oscar ... My father. His voice cracked slightly on the word. Vance said he was in the garden too, dreaming, waiting. I don't know if that's true or if the thing inside Vance was just saying what it knew would hurt me. But if there's even a chance. He met my eyes and I saw my own desperation reflected there. I can't sit here and wait for the end. Not when there's something I could do, even if it's stupid and pointless and probably won't work. Holloway looked between us, 2 men volunteering for what amounted to a death sentence. For a long moment I thought he would refuse, would order us to stand down, would invoke some authority that would keep us grounded while the world ended. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started dialing. Johnson Space Center, this is Holloway. I need the Icarus prototype prepped and ready for launch within 6 hours. Authorization code Delta 77 Omega. A pause. Yes, I know what I'm asking. Do it anyway. He hung up and fixed us both with a stare that held no hope, only grim acceptance. The craft can hold 2 passengers. It's got enough fuel for a one-way trip to the seed's current position, with maybe enough left over to maneuver once you're there. Maybe. You'll have basic EVA suits, some cutting equipment, and about 4 hours of oxygen once you leave the craft. That's it. No weapons, no backup, no extraction plan. Understood, I said. I don't think you do. But I don't think it matters at this point. Holloway turned to look at the rising sun. his profile sharp against the brightening sky. There's one more thing. The converted, the ones who dream of the garden, they can communicate with each other. Some kind of quantum entanglement in their neural patterns, we think. If your brother is really part of the network, and if you can reach the seed before activation, there might be a way to use that connection. To send a message back through the network and wake the dreamers up, break the harvest from the inside. How? I don't know. Gregory Ballard might, but he's back in Houston and we don't have time to consult him. You'd have to figure it out when you get there. He laughed bitterly. Assuming you get there. Assuming you survive long enough to try anything. Assuming any of this makes even the slightest bit of difference against something that's been planning our harvest since before time began. I thought about the spire, about the moment I'd touched it and pushed back with nothing but human emotion and desperate love. It hadn't been enough to save us, but it had been enough to crack something that should have been unbreakable. Maybe that was all we had. Human stubbornness, human love, human refusal to accept an ending someone else had written for us. "Get us to that craft," I said. "We'll figure out the rest." We left Vance with a security team that arrived by helicopter an hour later, the rotor wash scattering fragments of the shattered spire across the glass plane. He was still unconscious, still breathing that shallow breath, but his lips had started moving again, forming words in a language that had never been spoken on Earth. Whatever had been driven out of him was creeping back. The garden wanted its gardener. I watched them load him onto the helicopter, this man who had once been a brilliant scientist, a grieving father, a human being with all the complexity that implied. Now he was something else, something in between, and I couldn't help wondering if the same fate awaited everyone who'd glimpsed the garden in their dreams. The flight to Houston took 3 hours. Oscar sat across from me in the military transport, his eyes closed but his body tense, obviously not sleeping. I spent most of the time staring out the window at the clouds below, thinking about Elliot. Our mother's funeral had been the breaking point. She died slowly from a cancer that ate her over 18 months. Elliot had been there every day, holding her hand, changing her sheets, doing all the things I couldn't do because I was too busy with work, too scared to watch her disappear. When she finally passed, he'd looked at me with eyes full of exhaustion and betrayal and said things that were probably true. I'd said things back, worse things designed to hurt because I was hurting. We hadn't spoken since. 3 years of silence, of holidays alone, of pretending I didn't have a brother because it was easier than admitting I'd failed him. I wondered if he dreamed of me in his garden visions. I wondered if some part of him, some deep human part that hadn't been converted yet, was scared and alone and hoping someone would come. "Hold on," I thought, pressing my palm against the cold window glass. "I'm coming." Oscar's eyes opened. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with an understanding that didn't require words. "Do you think they can still hear us?" he asked quietly. "The ones in the garden? Do you think there's enough of them left to know we're trying?" "I don't know, but I have to believe there is." He nodded and closed his eyes. The sun was high when we landed at Johnson Space Center. Somewhere above us, invisible against the blue sky, the seed was accelerating toward its destiny. And somewhere below us, a ship was being prepared to carry 2 men on a journey that would end in salvation or oblivion. 15 hours remained, and I still hadn't figured out how to save the world. Only that I had to try, because giving up meant letting everything I loved become fertilizer for someone else's garden. That wasn't an ending I could accept, not while I still had breath in my lungs. The Icarus was smaller than I expected. A cramped capsule barely large enough for 2 men, bolted to a rocket assembly that looked like it had been built from spare parts and desperate prayers. The technicians who prepped us for launch moved with the grim efficiency of people who knew they were sending us to die but had run out of alternatives. Oscar sat beside me in the narrow cockpit, his shoulder pressed against mine in the confined space. Neither of us spoke as they sealed the hatch. There was nothing left to say. The launch was violent. G-forces crushed me into my seat, turning my vision grey at the edges, making every breath feel like drowning in concrete. I thought about Elliot, about the tire swing in our backyard, about the sound of his laugh before everything went wrong between us. I held onto those memories like anchors, refusing to let the pressure squeeze them out of me. And then suddenly we were floating. The earth curved below us, impossibly blue against the infinite black. I'd seen photographs, videos, simulations. None of them prepared me for the reality of seeing our world from above. So small, so fragile, so completely unaware of what was coming for it. "There," Oscar said, his voice tight. I followed his gaze through the capsule's small window. The seed hung in the darkness ahead, no longer invisible, no longer hiding. It had shed whatever camouflage had protected it for millennia, and now blazed with its own light, a geometric constellation of angles and surfaces that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating depths that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. It was beautiful, terrifyingly, heartbreakingly beautiful. "Adjusting trajectory," Oscar muttered, working the manual controls with hands that barely shook. "We'll reach it in approximately 40 minutes. After that..." He didn't finish the sentence. After that, we had 4 hours of oxygen and no plan. We drifted closer in silence, watching the seed grow larger in our window until it filled the entire view. The symbols on its surface were visible now, writhing and shifting like living things, and I felt their pull even through the capsule's hull. Whispers at the edge of my thoughts, promising peace, promising purpose, promising an end to all the loneliness and regret that had defined my life. I thought about Elliot again, forced myself to remember not the garden version, not the dream, but the real person. The brother who had cried at our mother's bedside while I stayed away. The brother who deserved an apology I'd never given him. The whispers receded slightly, not gone, but quieter. "I'm going out," I said, reaching for my EVA helmet. "Theodore, the capsule can't get any closer without being pulled in. One of us needs to stay here, keep the engines ready in case." In case of what? I didn't know. "Just be ready." Oscar grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, desperate, and when I turned to face him, I saw tears floating in the zero gravity, drifting from his eyes like tiny crystal spheres. "Find them," he said. "Your brother, my father, find them and bring them back." "I'll try." "No." His grip tightened. "Promise me. Promise me you'll try everything, even if it means not coming back yourself. Promise me their lives matter more than yours." I looked at this man I'd known for less than a week, this stranger who had become something more in the crucible of impossible circumstances. His face was close to mine, his breath warm in the cold capsule, and I understood what he was really asking. "I promise," I said. The airlock was barely large enough to fit through. I pushed myself into the void, tethered to the Icarus by a thin cable, and began the long drift toward the seed. Up close, it was even more overwhelming. The surfaces that had seemed solid from a distance were actually composed of countless smaller structures, fractals within fractals, complexity that made my mind ache when I tried to follow it. The symbols covered everything, and now I could see that they weren't carved into the surface. They were the surface, a language made physical, a message written in matter itself. I found an opening, a gap in the geometric patterns just large enough for a human body, as if it had been designed for exactly this purpose. As if everything had been designed for exactly this purpose. Inside, the seed was hollow, not empty, filled with light and movement, and something that might have been music if sound could exist in vacuum. I floated through chambers that shifted around me, corridors that led in directions my brain couldn't process until I reached the center. The garden was there, and not a metaphor, not a dream. An actual garden, somehow existing in the void, filled with plants that glowed with bioluminescence and flowers that bloomed in colors I'd never seen. And among the flowers, standing in neat rows like crops waiting for harvest, were people. Thousands of them, millions maybe. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful, their bodies rooted to the garden floor by tendrils of light that pulsed with the rhythm of their heartbeats. I recognized faces from the news, from the briefings, from the reports of Bloom syndrome victims around the world. And there, near the center, standing beside a man who must have been Oscar's father, based on the resemblance, was Elliot. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. But it was him, my brother, my blood, the person I'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist, because facing him meant facing my own failures. I floated toward him, my hand outstretched, and his eyes opened. Teddy. His voice was strange, layered with harmonics like Vance's had been, but underneath it I could hear him, the real him. You came. I came to take you home. This is home now. He smiled, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. You don't understand yet, but you will. The garden isn't a prison, it's a preservation. Everything we are, everything we've ever been, saved forever. No more death, no more loss, no more silence between brothers who should have known better. That's not living, that's being stored. Is there a difference? He reached out and touched my face, his fingers cold even through my helmet's faceplate. I've seen what's coming, Teddy. The universe is dying, entropy is winning. In a few trillion years, every star will burn out, every atom will decay, and everything that ever existed will be as if it never was. Unless something preserves it. Unless something harvests the light before the darkness comes. I stared at him, at the garden, at the countless preserved consciousnesses waiting in their rows. You're saying this thing is trying to save us? It's been trying to save everyone. Every intelligent species that ever evolved, across 1 billion galaxies, across 17 billion years. Planting seeds, waiting for civilizations to grow, harvesting them before they can be lost to the void. Elliot's eyes held depths that shouldn't fit in a human skull. We're not being consumed, Teddy. We're being rescued. And you can be rescued too. You can be with me, with Mom, with everyone we've ever lost, forever. The whispers surged back, louder than ever, and I felt myself drifting toward a space in the garden that seemed made for me. A spot beside Elliot, beside reconciliation, beside an eternity of peace. But something stopped me, a memory. Oscar's face in the capsule, his tears floating like stars, his desperate grip on my arm. Promise me their lives matter more than yours. What happens to Earth? I asked. When the harvest is complete? Elliot's smile flickered, just for a moment. The garden needs room to grow, the soil gets cleared. 8 billion people, not saved, cleared, composted to make room for the preserved. I can't let that happen. You can't stop it. No one can. The seed has been doing this since before the universe began. It's beyond resistance. Beyond... I grabbed him, wrapped my arms around my brother for the first time in 3 years, and held on with everything I had. Then I'll stay with you, I said, but not like this, not preserved. As myself, for as long as I have. Show me how to break the connection. Show me how to wake them up. Elliot trembled in my arms. The harmonics faded from his voice, and when he spoke again, he sounded like my brother. Just my brother. Teddy, I'm sorry. For what I said at the funeral. For blaming you. I knew you were scared. I knew you couldn't watch her go, and I made you feel like a monster for it. I held him tighter. I'm sorry too for not being there, for letting pride keep me away, for 3 years of silence. We're brothers now, we always were. For a moment, the garden seemed less alien. Just a place where 2 siblings had finally found the words they should have spoken years ago. Then I pulled back. Show me how to end this. There's a resonance, he whispered. At the center, deeper than this place. A frequency holding everything together. If you disrupt it, everyone wakes up. But the seed will die, Teddy. Everything it's preserved across 17 billion years will be lost. Civilizations we can't imagine. Consciousnesses waiting in peace since before our sun was born. You'd be killing them to save us. 1 trillion civilizations. All the harvested light of a dying universe. Against 8 billion lives on Earth who never chose to be cleared. Show me, I said. He did. The resonance point was deeper still, in a space that might have been the seed's heart. A single note hung there. Not sound, but something more fundamental. A vibration holding the garden together like gravity holds planets. You have to match the frequency, Elliot said, his hand gripping mine like we were children facing a thunderstorm. And then invert it. The seed will try to stop you. Don't listen. Just hold on to what makes you human and push. Will you help me? He smiled, the real smile. I already am. Every person in this garden, we're all connected, Right now, I'm asking them to help, asking them to choose. I felt it. Consciousness is waking, questioning, remembering, some angry, some grateful, some terrified, but enough of them chose. I matched the frequency, I inverted it, and I pushed with everything I had, every memory of Elliot's laugh, every regret, every moment of human connection. The garden shuddered. The seed screamed in frequencies that tore through my mind, and then silence. The roots released. The preserved consciousnesses scattered like seeds in wind. The garden wilted and died, and Elliot's hand slipped from mine. I woke up in a hospital bed in Houston, 17 days after the seed died. Oscar told me later that he'd pulled me from the wreckage. When the seed collapsed, it had ejected me like a splinter being pushed from infected flesh, and he'd somehow maneuvered the Icarus close enough to grab me before my oxygen ran out. The capsule barely made it back to Earth, coming down hard in the Gulf of Mexico, where a Navy recovery team fished us from the water like two very confused pieces of space debris. The world didn't know what had happened, not really. The official story involved a classified military satellite and an unexpected debris field. The Bloom syndrome victims woke up confused and frightened, with fragmented memories of gardens and peace and a choice they couldn't quite remember making. Most of them recovered. Some of them didn't. 3,000 people across the globe, suddenly freed from dreams they hadn't asked for, trying to rebuild lives that had been interrupted by something they would never fully understand. Elliot was one of the ones who recovered. He came to see me on my third day awake, walking into my hospital room with flowers from the gift shop and a nervousness that made him look 18 again instead of 38. We stared at each other for a long moment, two brothers separated by years and silence and something neither of us could name. Then he sat beside my bed, took my hand, and we talked. We talked for hours. About Mum, about the funeral, about all the things we should have said and didn't, all the time we wasted being angry when we could have been family. He cried. I cried. The nurses pretended not to notice. When visiting hours ended, he hugged me and promised to come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until I was well enough to leave. He kept that promise. He's still keeping it 3 months later as I sit on the porch of his house in Annapolis, the same house where we grew up, which he bought after Mom died because he couldn't bear to let strangers live there, and watch the sun set over the Chesapeake Bay. Oscar visits sometimes. His father woke up too, confused but alive. They're rebuilding their relationship slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything broken for too long. Last week, Oscar brought him to dinner, and I watched them struggle through a conversation about nothing important. And I thought about how strange it was that an ancient cosmic horror had given us all a second chance at the connections we'd abandoned. The seed is gone. Whatever consciousnesses it preserved across 17 billion years scattered when it died, returning to wherever consciousness goes when untethered from matter. I think about them sometimes. Wonder if I made the right choice, condemning 1 trillion preserved minds to oblivion so 8 billion could keep living their messy, temporary, beautiful lives. I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't think anyone could know that. But I know that my brother is inside right now, making dinner, and in a few minutes he's going to call me in and we're going to eat together like we used to when we were kids. I know that tomorrow the sun will rise and people will go to work and fall in love and make mistakes and try again. The universe is still dying, entropy is still winning. One day everything will end, but not today. Today we're still here. Still human, still choosing. That's enough.